At 78 years old, Wayne Buntion became the oldest inmate ever executed in Texas, a depressing milestone that highlighted the gravity of his crimes. His execution on April 21, 2022, marked the state's first in over 20 years, a decision that reignited debates about justice, accountability, and the death penalty. But what makes this case particularly haunting is the cold-blooded act that put him on death row, a crime that shattered a community and the victims' families. Early life. Wayne's story began in an environment that shaped the choices he would make later in life, for better or worse. Born on March 30, 1944, alongside his twin brother, Kenneth Buntion, Carl grew up in modest circumstances in Harris County, Texas, a small, tight-knit community where everyone knew each other. His family, while hard-working, struggled to make ends meet. Carl's father, James Durward Buntion, held a series of low-paying, physically demanding jobs, often leaving him exhausted and emotionally distant. Meanwhile, his mother, tasked with maintaining the household, was stretched thin between caring for Carl and his younger siblings. Despite these challenges, Carl showed early promise in school. Teachers noted his quick wit and sharp mind, qualities that could have set him on a legit path toward success. However, these strengths were overshadowed by behavioral issues. Carl had a defiant streak, often clashing with authority figures. While some saw this as youthful rebellion, others recognized it as a sign of deeper issues brewing beneath the surface. As Carl entered adolescence, the cracks in his life began to widen. His parents' strained relationship eventually led to a bitter separation, leaving Carl, his twin brother Kenneth, and their younger brother Bobby to navigate the fallout. The absence of his father was particularly impactful. With no stable male role model, Carl sought guidance elsewhere, often in the wrong places. He gravitated toward older boys in the neighborhood who seemed confident and self-assured, but were, in reality, involved in petty crimes and delinquent activities. These early associations introduced Carl to a lifestyle that prioritized quick and short-term rewards over long-term goals. What began as minor infractions, skipping school, shoplifting, or sneaking out at night, escalated over time. By his late teens, Carl had dropped out of school entirely. Without an education or stable employment prospects, he found himself relying on the very behaviors that had initially seemed thrilling and rebellious. Carl's criminal activities during this time were random and relatively low level, but they were a clear indicator of his trajectory. He started with minor thefts, targeting convenience stores and local businesses. These acts, while not violent, demonstrated a growing disregard for the rules of society. He quickly developed a reputation in his community as someone to avoid, a young man with a dangerous edge and little concern for consequences. In his early 20s, Carl's life took a darker turn. By this point, he had been in and out of juvenile detention centers and had a criminal record that included theft, vandalism, and public disturbances. These run-ins with the law only deepened his cynicism, reinforcing a belief that the system was rigged against him. He stopped looking for legitimate work and instead focused entirely on illicit activities, often working with gangs to plan and execute petty crimes. According to sources, one pivotal moment came when Carl was introduced to a more seasoned gang leader during a stint in jail. This individual was also serving time in jail and had a history of violent offenses, took Carl under his wing, mentoring him in more serious forms of crime. Carl's transition from petty theft to more organized and calculated criminal behavior was swift. He began participating in burglaries, learning how to break into homes and businesses without leaving a trace. These crimes, while more lucrative, also carried greater risks. Carl's personal relationships suffered during this period. Friends and family members who had once tried to steer him toward a better path began to distance themselves, either out of fear or frustration. Even those who cared deeply for him found it difficult to reconcile the person they once knew with the increasingly hardened individual he had become. Despite his growing notoriety, Carl showed little remorse for his actions. When confronted, he often dismissed his behavior, claiming that he was simply doing what he needed to survive. However, those close to him suspected that his actions were driven less by necessity and more by a deep-seated anger and need for control. His descent into a life of crime was complete. He had become adept at navigating the criminal underworld, building a network of contacts who could supply him with tools, information, or alibis as needed. His crimes grew bolder and more dangerous, pushing the boundaries of what he had previously been willing to risk. The crimes. By the time Carl reached his late 20s, his criminal activities took a sharp and dangerous turn as he transitioned from petty offenses to more serious and organized crimes. His actions, once random and low stakes, became methodical and increasingly severe. It was around this time where Carl had established himself as a calculated individual, willing to push legal and moral boundaries for personal gain. One of Carl's first known major crimes occurred when he orchestrated a burglary at a local jewelry store. This was no impulsive act. It was carefully planned. Carl scouted the location for weeks, studying the store's security measures and identifying weak points. On the night of the break-in, he used tools provided by a contact he met during a prior stint in jail. The robbery was swift and clean, leaving law enforcement initially puzzled about how he had bypassed the alarm system. Although Carl avoided immediate detection, this crime put him on law enforcement's radar. Investigators discovered a pattern when similar robberies occurred in nearby towns, all marked by a lack of physical evidence and the same targeted approach. Emboldened by his initial success, Carl began targeting high-end homes and businesses. These crimes demonstrated his ability to adapt and refine his methods. For residential break-ins, Carl would often strike during the early evening when families were out for dinner or attending events. In some cases, he used insider information obtained through casual acquaintances, learning about security systems and household schedules. What set Carl apart was his meticulous planning. He would use disguises to blend into neighborhoods and avoid suspicion, ensuring no detail was overlooked. While these crimes rarely involved violence, they created a sense of unease in the communities he targeted. Homeowners expressed fear and frustration, leading to heightened security measures and local law enforcement increasing their patrols. Carl's shift from calculated burglaries to more reckless actions occurred during one of his break-ins. In what was supposed to be a routine burglary, he unexpectedly encountered a homeowner who had returned earlier than anticipated. Startled, Carl panicked and used force to subdue the individual. Although the homeowner survived the encounter, the event marked a turning point in Carl's criminal trajectory. It was no longer just about theft. Violence had entered the equation. This incident attracted significant media attention, with headlines describing the intruder as a dangerous and unpredictable threat. Community members began rallying for more robust police efforts, and law enforcement ramped up their investigation, determined to connect the dots between the growing list of crimes. Following the botched burglary, Carl's crimes grew more audacious. He shifted his focus to armed robberies, targeting convenience stores and small businesses that lacked substantial security measures. Armed with a weapon, Carl often threatened employees to ensure compliance, but he rarely inflicted physical harm. One notable robbery occurred at a gas station in Harris County late at night. Carl entered wearing a ski mask and brandished a firearm, demanding cash from the clerk. While no one was injured, the robbery left the employees traumatized and the community outraged. Surveillance footage from the store provided investigators with a blurry but usable image of the suspect, further tightening the noose around Carl's activities. By this point, law enforcement began piecing together a profile of Carl Wayne. Investigators noted similarities across the crimes, including his careful planning, use of minimal physical evidence, and preference for striking vulnerable locations. They also observed that Carl rarely operated with accomplices, making it challenging to track him through associates. The turning point in the investigation came when forensic evidence from one of Carl's earlier crimes linked him to a vehicle he had borrowed during a robbery. The connection, though weak, gave investigators a lead that they pursued relentlessly. Carl's criminal spree reached its apex on June 27, 1990, with a bold and tragic act that not only sealed his fate, but left a deep scar on Houston, Texas. During a routine traffic stop, Carl Wayne Buntion fatally shot Houston police officer James Irby, a crime that became the defining moment of Carl's life and the ultimate breaking point in his years of escalating criminal behavior. Officer James Irby, a 37-year-old veteran of the force and father of two, had been conducting a traffic stop for a minor violation. The driver, an acquaintance of Carl's with a history of petty offenses, had no idea the encounter would end in bloodshed. Carl was a passenger in the vehicle, a fact that would alter the course of events. As Officer Irby approached the vehicle, Carl's mindset was clear. He was armed, desperate, and unwilling to face another stint behind bars. The moment the officer neared the driver's side, Carl exited the car abruptly. Witnesses later recounted that Carl appeared calm but calculating, as though he had already decided his course of action. Without warning, Carl raised his .357 Magnum revolver and fired directly at Officer Irby, hitting him in the head. As the officer fell to the ground, Carl fired additional shots into his back to ensure the kill before fleeing on foot. The scene that followed was one of chaos and horror. Witnesses, including nearby pedestrians and other drivers, reported hearing the gunshots and seeing Carl flee. One witness described the sheer terror of the moment, saying that the sound of gunfire was followed by the sight of Officer Irby collapsing to the ground. Emergency responders arrived quickly, but it was too late. Officer Irby was pronounced dead at the scene. The murder was not just an attack on an individual. It was seen as an assault on the entire community. Officer Irby had served on the Houston police force for over a decade, earning a reputation as a dedicated and compassionate public servant. The loss of a father, husband, and law enforcement officer sent shockwaves through the city, leaving both the police department and the public reeling. After Officer Irby's unfortunate murder, the Houston Police Department launched an all-out effort to locate and apprehend Carl, while the community mourned the loss of one of its own. Public outcry grew rapidly, with many demanding swift action and harsh punishment for Carl's actions. Memorials for Officer Irby were held across the city, with hundreds of residents and law enforcement officers attending to pay their respects. The case also gained significant media attention, both locally and nationally. News outlets covered the story extensively, portraying Carl as a dangerous and remorseless criminal. The pressure on law enforcement to capture Carl intensified with each passing day, as the city of Houston demanded answers. With his name and face plastered across newspapers and television screens, Carl's days on the run were numbered. The murder galvanized detectives and the broader police force, who were now determined not just to bring Carl to justice, but to ensure that such a crime would never happen again. Carl's arrest came shortly after the fatal shooting. Acting on tips from witnesses, law enforcement tracked him to a motel where he was staying under a false name. A tactical team surrounded the building, cutting off all potential escape routes. Realizing he was cornered, Carl attempted to flee through a back exit, but was quickly apprehended. The arrest marked the end of Carl's years-long criminal activities and brought a sense of relief to a community reeling from the loss of Officer Irby. Authorities recovered key evidence from Carl's motel room, including burglary tools, stolen property, and a .3 M57 Magnum revolver, the weapon used in the murder. These items not only tied him to the crime, but also bolstered the case prosecutors would build against him. The trial. After Carl Wayne Buntion's arrest, the legal system quickly moved to bring him to trial, with the case gaining significant media attention. The brutal murder of Officer James Irby, a beloved Houston police officer, had shaken the community to its core. Residents eagerly followed every development, with the courtroom packed during each session as prosecutors meticulously laid out their case. The prosecution built its argument around Carl's long history of criminal behavior, culminating in the fatal shooting of Officer Irby. Items recovered from Carl's motel room, including burglary tools, a firearm, and stolen property, bolstered their case. However, the centerpiece of their argument was the evidence directly linking Carl to the killing of Officer Irby. This was no ordinary trial. It was seen as a fight for justice for the family of a father, husband, and public servant who had been gunned down in cold blood. The prosecution's case hinged on several critical pieces of evidence. Ballistics tests conclusively matched the firearm recovered at Carl's arrest to the bullets that killed Officer Irby. Eyewitnesses from the scene described seeing Carl fire the fatal shots and fleeing on foot. Additionally, surveillance footage from nearby businesses placed Carl at the scene of the crime just moments before the shooting. Perhaps the most powerful moments of the trial came during the emotional testimonies from Officer Irby's family. His wife, Maura Irby, described the devastating impact of losing her husband. She recounted how their children, aged 7 and 3 at the time, struggled to understand why their father wasn't coming home. Her testimony painted a heartbreaking picture of the personal cost of Carl's actions, leaving the jury visibly moved. The defense attempted to mitigate the charges by emphasizing Carl's troubled upbringing and mental state. They argued that his life of crime was a product of systemic failures and abusive experiences, urging the jury to consider life imprisonment instead of the death penalty. However, this argument struggled to gain traction against the overwhelming evidence and the emotional weight of the Irby family's loss. A turning point in the trial came when law enforcement officers detailed the calculated nature of Carl's actions during the shooting. Prosecutors highlighted how Carl shot Officer Irby multiple times, including in the back, to ensure he wouldn't survive. This deliberate act left no room for doubt about Carl's intent, further solidifying the case against him. Throughout the trial, Carl's demeanor remained detached. He showed little emotion, even during the most damning testimonies or when the Irby family spoke of their grief. Observers noted his lack of visible remorse, interpreting it as either indifference or a refusal to confront the gravity of his actions. When given the opportunity to address the court, Carl's statement was brief and deflected responsibility. He acknowledged his role in Officer Irby's death but attributed his behavior to his troubled past and lack of opportunities. These words, lacking genuine contrition, failed to sway the jury, who had already been presented with overwhelming evidence of his guilt. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict, guilty on all counts, including capital murder for the killing of Officer Irby. The decision was unanimous, reflecting the strength of the evidence and the gravity of Carl's actions. Following his conviction, Carl was transferred to Polunsky Unit, a maximum security prison located in Livingston, Texas, to await execution. Life on death row was a stark contrast to the freedom he had once taken for granted. Confined to a small cell for most of the day, Carl had limited interaction with others, save for occasional visits from legal representatives or prison staff. During his time on death row, Carl's legal team filed multiple appeals in an attempt to overturn his sentence. They argued that his upbringing and mental state should have been given more weight during the trial. However, these appeals were largely unsuccessful, with higher courts upholding the original verdict and sentence. Carl's time in prison was marked by isolation and introspection. Accounts from prison staff suggest that he spent much of his time reading and writing, though the content of his writings remains largely unknown. Some speculate that he may have been reflecting on his life and the choices that had led him to this point, while others believe he was simply trying to pass the time. As Carl's execution date drew closer, the mood on death row shifted. Prison staff noted a change in his demeanor, describing him as quieter and more withdrawn. It was clear that the reality of his situation had begun to set in. Legal avenues for appeal were nearly exhausted, and the finality of his sentence was very close. The final 24 hours. The final chapter of Carl Wayne Buntion's life began on the evening of April 20th, 2022. At approximately 7 p.m., prison staff formally informed Carl of the schedule for his execution the following day. Although he had known the date for weeks, this notification brought the inevitability of his fate into clear focus. Reports indicate that Carl spent the evening in his cell, appearing calm yet introspective. Guards observed him quietly reading a Bible for much of the night. Whether this was an act of faith or simply a means to pass the time remains unclear, but it set a somber tone for the hours ahead. By 10 p.m., the prison adhered to its standard routine of lights out. Carl lay on his cot, though it is uncertain whether he managed to sleep. Prison staff later noted that it is common for inmates facing execution to find rest elusive, burdened by the weight of their impending fate. At 6 a.m. on April 21, 2022, Carl was awakened by prison staff to begin his final day. He was offered breakfast consisting of standard prison fare, though he barely touched it. This lack of appetite reflected the gravity of his situation and a subdued state of mind. Elsewhere in the facility, preparations for the execution were underway. Guards maintained a strict schedule to ensure all protocols were followed, while Carl remained compliant. Around 9 a.m., Carl met briefly with his attorney, David Dow. This meeting, largely procedural, provided an opportunity to address any lingering legal matters or personal reflections. By this point, all appeals had been exhausted, and there was little left to discuss. Accounts suggest that Carl appeared resigned, expressing a mixture of regret and acceptance. David Dow later described the interaction as somber but professional, noting that Carl displayed little emotion during the exchange. At approximately 11 a.m., Carl was granted a final visit from family members. While estranged from much of his family for years, they came to say their goodbyes in a meeting described as tense but meaningful. The visit, lasting less than an hour, offered a brief moment of human connection before the inevitable. Family members refrained from discussing the details of his crimes, instead focusing on offering solace during his final hours. Due to Texas policy, Carl was not offered a special last meal of his choosing. Instead, he was served the same standard meal provided to all inmates that day. Reports indicate that Carl ate very little, reflecting a subdued and introspective demeanor. Witnesses also observed Carl sitting in his cell, often staring at the walls in silence. His lack of appetite highlighted the weight of his situation, though he outwardly remained calm. By 3 p.m., Carl was moved to a holding cell adjacent to the execution chamber. This marked the transition from the routine of death row to the final hours before his execution. Guards conducted routine checks, ensuring compliance with strict protocol. During this period, Carl reportedly spent time in quiet prayer. Whether this reflected genuine faith or an effort to find solace is unclear. Witnesses described him as calm and resigned, showing no visible signs of panic or defiance. At 6:00 p.m., Carl was escorted into the execution chamber at the Huntsville unit in Huntsville, Texas. Among those present were members of Officer James Irby's family, legal representatives, and media personnel. Each carried their own emotions into the room, ranging from quiet anticipation to somber reflection. Carl was secured to the gurney as the execution team prepared to administer the lethal injection. When asked if he had any final words, Carl addressed those present in a calm voice. He acknowledged his crimes and expressed regret, stating his hope that his death might bring peace to those he had harmed. The lethal injection process began at 6:15 p.m. Medical professionals administered the drugs in a precise sequence, designed to ensure a swift and painless death. After about 24 minutes, Carl Wayne Buntion was pronounced dead at 6:39 p.m. on April 21, 2022, at the age of 78. He became the oldest inmate ever executed in Texas and the state's first execution of 20.